December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, according to President F.D. Roosevelt. And it's the day in which Pearl Harbor was attacked and the day in which air and naval power changed forever. I'm John Buckley and I teach the War Studies degree program here at Wolverhampton. During the Second World War, the integration of air and naval power dramatically altered, and it is most famously associated with the developments in the so-called Pacific War between the Japanese Navy and the American Navy in particular, which was fought out between 1941 and 1945. The outbreak of the war was caused by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the American fleet, the Hawaiian Islands in the Pacific on December 7th, 1941. How did it get to that? Why did the Japanese choose to use that method, and how did the idea come together? Japan had been looking for a way in which to take the war to the United States since 1939. There was a real concern about directly attacking the Americans would be a real gamble and a real problem because America economically was much bigger, much more powerful than Japan. But Japan had been engaged in a long-term war in China since 1937 and was looking to expand its imperial reach and growth across Asia, which brought it into conflict with the other imperial powers in the region, particularly the British, the French, the Dutch, and also to a degree, although not directly imperially, the Americans in their half of the Pacific. The problem for the Japanese was that the Americans presented a major threat. Their navy in particular was considered a way in which the United States might interfere with what the Japanese were going to try and do if they used force and went to war to expand their territories in their half of the Pacific. The problem was, how would you neutralize the US Navy? How would you get rid of that problem in order to buy time for Japan to go into the offensive? Now, the original idea, dating back into the 1920s and 1930s, was to fight a defensive battle, allow the American fleet to come across the Pacific towards you, and you would use your bases, your half of the Pacific, along with your fleet, to wear it down and create problems, inflict casualties, break up the American fleet, such that when you did have the final showdown battle, things would be balanced, and the Japanese, who would have focused much more on tactics and their fighting abilities, would be able to overwhelm the American fleet. And that would then buy sufficient time for the Japanese to secure the territories they wanted in the Pacific. However, in 1939-1940, the new head of the Japanese fleet, Soroku Yamamoto, decided that a more aggressive and offensive strategy needed to be employed. He needed to find a way to get at the American fleet and inflict casualties on it ahead of the final showdown. So in other words, look for a way to take the battle, take the war to the American fleet. By 1941, that was starting to become a possibility for two particular reasons. Firstly, the Japanese had noted that the British in 1940 had used an aircraft carrier task force launching aircraft from distance and attacked the Italian fleet in harbour at Taranto in Italy. And they'd done considerable damage and knocked out a number of Italian ships. So the Japanese looked how they might explore that particular option and use an offensive strategy against an American fleet in a similar kind of situation. Now, the Japanese and the Americans were advanced in their development of aircraft technologies and capabilities, long-distance operations, flying from aircraft carriers. Aircraft could fly 170 miles thereabouts, far away from a carrier, launch an attack, and then fly back to their carrier. So it appeared to be an option. And so the Japanese started to explore the idea of how they might use those methods in order to launch an attack on the Americans. The Americans, looking to contain the Japanese, had posted their fleet, moved it from the west coast of the United States, and placed it right in the middle of the Pacific on Pearl Harbor, which is on the Hawaiian Islands, slap bang in the middle of the Pacific, in a way to show their willingness to use force if necessary to contain the Japanese. By placing the fleet there, however, it meant it would have to be defended, and it was then close enough that the Japanese imagined they could, in certain circumstances, mass all their aircraft carriers together and maneuver to a position where they could launch an airstrike against the American fleet. This thinking developed, and lots of tactical solutions were devised to how you could attack a major enemy fleet in port, in the way in which you use torpedoes and bombs in order to launch the attack successfully. The two main ways in which you sink ships at sea in the 1940s were either dive bombing attacks, where you sweep down from high altitude directly onto a target to drop a bomb onto the deck. That could do lots of damage to a ship. It was the most accurate way of hitting a ship, particularly if it's moving at sea. But the most deadly and destructive way of sinking a ship was to use torpedoes. And so the alternative method was torpedo bombing, which is aircraft coming at a very low level and dropping torpedoes, which would then hit the ship underwater below the waterline and cause it to sink. Torpedo bombing, however, was more dangerous and suffered heavier casualties when you're carrying out the attacks. You also had fighter aircraft to protect all of your aircraft as you went into the attack. So you had effectively a three-way split: dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. Attacking in port created more difficulty still because of the anti-aircraft guns. The enemy would perceive the enemy would react. There were torpedo nets to prevent torpedo bombers from getting in and attacking a ship in port. And so all sorts of tactical measures had to be employed in order to solve those problems. As the international situation deteriorated in the autumn of 1941, Yamamoto's plan started to come into play. And the idea of launching a preemptive strike, almost a surprise raid on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, really came into play. And so in December, the Japanese had moved their fleet to within range of Pearl Harbor, and on December 7th, 1941, launched aircraft, over 300, from 6 aircraft carriers, the only time that all 6 Japanese fleet aircraft carriers operated together, and launched an all-out attack on the American fleet. It was supposed to coincide with the declaration of war, but unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, the declaration of war never came, and so the attack took place and caught the Americans by surprise. They missed a number of possible ways of countering it, but nonetheless the attack went in. And it was dramatically successful. There are 8 battleships in the American Pacific Fleet. They're the largest and heaviest warships available to the Americans. And all of those ships were either sunk or severely damaged or badly damaged, and all were put out of action for a period of time. Many other installations were also attacked in other ships, and although more might have been achieved by a second air attack on December 7th, it was still a huge success for the Japanese. They lost a number of aircraft, but not that many, and the 6 aircraft carriers and their escorting vessels managed to escape without any significant losses. The one thing they didn't achieve was to target and find the American aircraft carriers. The Americans had their own aircraft carriers as well as battleships, and they were supposed to have been in port on December 7th, but they weren't. They were out. And so the Japanese never found them and didn't sink them. So the American carriers remained an ongoing potential threat to Japanese ambitions in the Pacific. Now, for the next few months, the Japanese military and navy spread their offensive operations right out across the Pacific, capturing many island groups, sweeping down the coast into Indochina, through Burma to the very borders of India. They occupied the Dutch East Indies, and the navy, although suffering a few losses, fundamentally held together. There were no serious losses during that time. It was a dramatic level of effectiveness on the part of the Japanese. The other allied navies, the Dutch and the British navies in Asia, were effectively swept out of the way. Only the American Navy remained as a serious player in the Pacific, but they were keeping out of the way. They were badly outnumbered. All their heavy gun battleships had been knocked out, so they're totally reliant on their aircraft carriers. The Americans were looking for a way in which to employ those aircraft carriers to try and strike back at the Japanese. The commander of the US Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, was looking for opportunities, with low-risk opportunities in which he could use his aircraft carriers to strike at the Japanese, score a success, and then get out of the way, because he knew he would remain heavily outnumbered well into 1943, and so they weren't able to go necessarily fully onto the offensive until then. The first major engagement between carrier fleets took place in the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. It was a bit of a score draw, if you like. There were losses on both sides. It was a confused battle. The Americans lost one main fleet aircraft carrier. The Japanese lost a smaller aircraft carrier, but had damage done to another one. And there was a trade-off, if you like, but it was a stalemate. What it highlighted to the Japanese, and to Yamamoto in particular, was that the American carriers remained a threat and would have to be dealt with. So he started to push a new idea, a new concept, in order to draw the Americans into battle. And he targeted Midway. which is an atoll group to the north west of the Hawaiian Islands, but within a dangerous level of range to Hawaii itself. By threatening those islands, the Midway Atoll group, the Japanese believed the Americans would be forced to come out to try and defend them. So Yamamoto's plan was to send his aircraft carriers in, backed by his other battleships and other escort groups and things further back, send the carriers in, target to Midway, attack it, and then draw the Americans out into a battle in and around the Midway Atoll group. And in many ways, it would be a perfect way of achieving the objective of drawing the American carriers into battle and destroying them. It would then buy the Japanese another few months, perhaps another year, of operations in the Pacific where the Americans would not be able to intervene in any meaningful kind of way. The plan was very complicated, but seemed to have some kind of strategic sense to it in some ways, although many in the Japanese Navy worried about it. But for the Americans, their concern in May and June 1942 was, what are the Japanese now going to do? And they had one particular advantage working in their favour, and that was the work of their intelligence unit in Pearl Harbor, particularly their cryptanalysis department. The Americans have been detecting Japanese naval traffic for all the way since the beginning of the war, in the same way that everybody else did, intercepting radio transmissions, and they were starting to break into the codes that the Japanese were using. And by May 1942, the intelligence and cryptanalysis unit at Pearl Harbor under Joe Rochefort Jr. was convinced to a significant degree that the next target of Japanese operations was Midway. There were lots of dissenting voices in the American intelligence network, and Nimitz himself eventually had to be convinced that Rochefort and his team knew what they were doing, and he went with their analysis. He agreed with their interpretation, partly based on setting traps and so on about what the Japanese were up to in terms of the use of intelligence traffic, and they got a very good picture of what the Japanese were up to. Nimitz decided that he would spring the trap, or attempt to spring the trap, on the Japanese themselves. So, under the command of Jack Fletcher and Ray Spruance, the Americans used their 3 aircraft carriers. The Japanese only believed they had 2, but the Americans had 3, and moved into position, ready to intercept the Japanese carriers the moment they started launching their attack on Midway. And by the morning of the 4th of June 1942, the Americans had positioned their carriers such that when the Japanese carriers under the command of Nagumo launched their attack on Midway, the American carriers were able to launch their attack right at the particular moment in order to catch the Japanese at their most vulnerable. The commander who took that decision in particular was Ray Spruance, and he had to take a decision based on calculated risk, something that Nimitz had issued orders for. Seize the moment to take the risk. And the risk was the Americans were just a bit too far away to launch their attack safely. So he had to take the risk, launch at a very extreme range in order to catch the Japanese at the right moment. And then he would have to hope he'd be able to recover his aircraft afterwards. If he delayed and waited and proved careful and cautious, the moment might have been lost. The Japanese, in contrast, Nagumo, when he found out about the location of the American fleet, played cautiously, and he carefully tried to organize a full attack rather than sending off what he had available at that particular moment. And he stuck to the rules which had served him quite well up until that point in the Pacific War. Unfortunately, he never got the time to launch the major attack that he wanted. The American attack came in, and with other air attacks from Midway Island itself, and eventually, despite heavy losses, the Americans inflicted a crippling series of losses on the Japanese carriers. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk in the space of a few minutes. A few minutes, some say, decided the war in the Pacific. That might be exaggerating it to a degree, but it had serious effects on the outcome of that particular battle and operation and the campaign overall. In a series of to and fro airstrikes later on the 4th of June, the Americans eventually lost an aircraft carrier, and the Japanese lost their 4th. So all 4 Japanese big aircraft carriers were sunk at the Battle of Midway. The Americans only lost 1. It was a dramatic change in fortunes, and the whole Japanese offensive effort in the Pacific War was blunted. They carried on with offensive operations in the autumn of 1942, but the high point of their capabilities has been reached, and the Americans had started to wrestle control of the Pacific War from them. By 1943, it was the Americans who were squarely on the offensive and building up huge naval capacity that the Japanese could never manage and match. So effectively, the Pacific War swung decisively in the Americans' favour. Naval warfare is a fundamental part of the War City degree programme here at the University of Wolverhampton. We explore it in many areas, modules, First and Second World War, 19th century. We have specialists in the area, and we explore aspects of technology, tactics, operations, and the integration of all of that in the flow of history. If you want to know more, click the links in the description.